All right, today we're jumping into the Book of Jarom. It's this super interesting but really short part of an ancient record. And it kicks off with a problem that feels surprisingly modern. What do you do when you just don't have enough space to tell your whole story?
I mean, seriously, think about that for a second. What if someone handed you a single piece of paper and said, okay, summarize the last 40 years of history on this? The wars, the breakthroughs, what people believed in, everything. You've got almost no room. What do you even choose to write down? What's the most important stuff that absolutely has to make the cut?
Well, believe it or not, that was the exact situation for an ancient record keeper named Jarom. It was his job, passed down from his dad, Anos, to keep this family history going, this really important record of their people, the Nephites. But he had a big problem.
Yeah, he was basically working with limited real estate. He comes right out and says it. The metal plates he was carving into were small, so he had to be brief. He couldn't go on, couldn't write down every little detail, no grand prophecies or anything. He had to get right to the point. So what was the one story he thought was so important it had to be told?
Turns out it was a story all about survival, a story defined by this huge ongoing conflict between two groups, his own people, the Nephites, and their rivals, the Lamanites. So by the time Jarom even picks up his tools to start writing, a full 200 years have gone by since his ancestors first showed up in this new land. And in those 2 centuries, the Nephites had really grown. They'd become this strong, powerful society. But of course, they weren't alone. And Jarom paints this really stark picture, right? He basically sets up this major contrast. On one side, you've got his people, the Nephites. He says they're all about following religious law, keeping order, building these strong, fortified cities. And then, on the other side, you have the Lamanites. He describes them as being way more numerous, but also, well, pretty violent. He says they loved murder and would even drink the blood of beasts. So this deep-seated opposition between them meant they were pretty much always at war. So, facing this constant threat, Jarom lays out what is basically a formula for survival. It's almost mathematical, this clear cause and effect relationship that he says completely governs his people's existence. It's what decides if they're going to succeed or just get wiped out. And here it is. This is the core idea. It's a promise from God that's been passed down for generations. Jarom puts it super plainly. If you keep the commandments, you will prosper. That's it. That's the foundational rule of their entire society. And Jarom gets really specific about what this prosperity actually looked like. We're not just talking about being rich with gold and silver, though they had that too. We're talking about real technological progress. They were skilled craftsmen, they built machinery, and they mastered working with metals like iron and steel to make everything from farming tools to the advanced weapons they needed to survive. This prosperity, this was their strength. But, there's always a flip side, right? The prophets were constantly reminding them of what would happen if they broke this formula. If they messed up, if they disobeyed the commandments, the result was just as certain as prosperity. Total and complete destruction. I mean, the stakes just could not have been higher. Okay, so if the people had this tendency to stray, how in the world did they manage to avoid getting destroyed? Well, Jarom explains that they had this sort of built-in correction system. Think of it like an early warning alarm for their whole society. And you've got to give Jarom credit. He's brutally honest about his own people. He says that even with these super clear rules, they were often stubborn, or as he puts it, they had hardness of their hearts. They just kept forgetting this simple formula for survival. So yeah, they were far from perfect, and that internal struggle was a huge, constant threat. And this is where the solution comes in. It's this cycle that just repeats itself. First, the people would start to mess up. Then the prophets and teachers would jump in and, using some pretty harsh language, they would prick their hearts and basically shake them up until they repented. It was this constant course correction for the entire society, pulling them back from the edge and getting them back on track. So after laying out this whole spiritual and political system, this whole formula, Jarom wraps up his very short record. His job as the historian is done. Just to put it on a timeline for a sec, he starts writing around the 200-year mark of their history. He covers the next 38 years, which he says were just filled with wars and all kinds of conflict. And then finally, in year 238, he calls it quits. His part of the story is told. So, with his summary of the last 4 decades all wrapped up, Jarom does his final duty as record keeper. He takes those small plates and he hands them over to his son, Omni. He passes on that same commandment, keep the history going for the people who come after. The story just had to continue.
So, in the end, the huge idea that Jerem manages to squeeze onto his tiny plates is really this timeless question. He shows us a people who became incredibly successful. They were wealthy, they were technologically advanced, but all of it, every single bit of it, was tied to a strict moral code. The second those principles started to slip, their whole society was at risk. And it really makes you think, doesn't it? For any society, anywhere, anytime, how do you balance that drive for prosperity and power with the core principles that got you there in the first place? That's the big question Jerem's tiny record leaves us wrestling with.